July 14, 1941. Orsha Railway Junction, Soviet Belarus. The humid afternoon air hangs heavy over the tracks where trains marked with the swastika sit idle, packed with fuel tankers and ammunition crates intended for the front lines. German soldiers of the 12th Panzer Division relax in the shadow of the carriages, unbuttoning their tunics and smoking cigarettes with the casual arrogance of a conquering army that has seen nothing but victory for weeks. They believe the Red Army is broken, scattered, and incapable of mounting a significant counterattack in this sector. The station is a hive of activity, a vital artery feeding the Wehrmacht's drive toward Smolensk, and eventually, Moscow. High on a steep bank overlooking the Dnieper River, obscured by the dense foliage of a pine forest, Captain Ivan Flerov wipes sweat from his brow as he peers through his rangefinder. His heart hammers against his ribs, not just from the stifling heat, but from the immense weight of the secret he commands. 7 strange-looking trucks, distinct from anything else in the Soviet arsenal, sit silently behind him, their camouflage nets pulled back to reveal angled steel rails pointing toward the sky. This is the first experimental battery of field rocket artillery, and Flerov knows that failure here is not an option for him or his men. The Soviet captain checks his watch and signals his battery crew, who move with the frantic precision of men handling unstable explosives. They have spent days maneuvering these heavy Ziz-6 trucks through swamps and backroads to avoid detection by the Luftwaffe, carrying strict orders to destroy the equipment rather than let it fall into enemy hands. The target coordinates are locked in, and the elevation screws are tightened to align the rails with the bustling station below. Flerov takes a deep breath, the smell of pine needles and engine oil filling his nose, and gives the fateful order to open fire on the unsuspecting enemy. Suddenly, the tranquility of the forest is ripped apart by a deafening, grinding screech that sounds like the sky itself is being torn in two. Tongues of bright orange flame erupt from the back of the trucks, kicking up clouds of dust and scorching the earth as the rockets leave the rails. The sheer violence of the launch shakes the ground, and within seconds, a salvo of over 100 M13 projectiles is arching high into the summer sky. The noise is unlike anything heard in warfare before, a terrifying, high-pitched howl that rises in intensity as the missiles accelerate toward their target with deadly velocity. Down in the rail yard, the German soldiers freeze, their eyes darting upward as the strange wailing sound drowns out the noise of shunting locomotives. They expect the familiar whistle of artillery shells or the drone of dive bombers, but this is a different beast entirely. Before a single order to take cover can be shouted, the sky rains fire. The rockets slam into the station in a dense cluster, detonating with a ferocity that shatters steel and splinters wood. The fuel tankers parked on the sidings erupt instantly, sending massive fireballs rolling through the terrified infantrymen who are caught completely in the open. The devastation is total and instantaneous, turning the strategic hub into a raging inferno within the span of 10 seconds. The distinct warheads, packed with high explosives, create overlapping shockwaves that pulverize the rail cars and the men standing beside them. Unlike a standard artillery barrage which walks shells across a target over minutes, this weapon delivers its entire payload at once, saturating the area with destruction. The heat is so intense that the rails themselves begin to twist and warp, while the ammunition crates stacked on the platforms begin to cook off, adding secondary explosions to the cacophony of death. Panic grips the survivors who stumble blindly through the black smoke, coughing and screaming for medics who are either dead or too stunned to act. The psychological impact is immediate and profound, as the German troops have no frame of reference for what just hit them. Rumors spread like wildfire among the chaotic ranks that the Russians have developed an automatic flame-throwing cannon or that the earth beneath them has simply exploded. The confidence that permeated the station only moments ago has evaporated, replaced by a primal fear of this invisible, screeching predator that strikes without warning. Back on the riverbank, Captain Flerov does not linger to admire the burning ruin he has created. The smoke trails from the rockets serve as a giant arrow pointing directly to his position, and he knows German artillery spotters will be searching for him within minutes. He barks orders to his drivers, and the battery engages in a tactic that will become their hallmark shoot and scoot. The trucks roar to life, lurching out of their firing positions and retreating deeper into the forest before the enemy can triangulate their location for a counter-battery strike. The report that reaches the German Army Group Center headquarters later that day is filled with confusion and alarm. Field commanders describe a hurricane of fire that melted metal and broke the morale of seasoned veterans in a single stroke. General Franz Holder, the chief of the General Staff, notes the incident with concern, marking the appearance of a new Soviet heavy weapon that defies conventional classification. Intelligence officers begin frantic efforts to identify the source of the attack, unaware that they have just witnessed the birth of a legend that will haunt them all the way to the Reichstag. The weapon that caused this havoc is the BM-13, a mobile rocket launcher mounted on a simple bow, rugged truck chassis. It is a weapon born of Soviet engineering philosophy: simple, mass-producible, and devastating in volume. While a traditional howitzer prides itself on pinpoint accuracy, the rocket launcher relies on saturation, flooding a specific grid square with enough explosives to ensure nothing survives. The rockets are fin-stabilized but lack guidance, meaning they wobble in flight and disperse over a wide area. But this inaccuracy is exactly what makes them so effective against soft targets like infantry and supply depots. The rockets themselves are simple steel cylinders filled with nitrocellulose propellant, yet they represent a significant leap in ballistics. The M13 projectile carries nearly 5 kilograms of high explosive, far more than a conventional shell of similar weight, because it does not require thick steel walls to withstand the pressure of a gun barrel. This thin casing allows the warhead to fragment into thousands of razor-sharp shards upon impact, shredding anything in the vicinity. The sheer quantity of explosives delivered in seconds creates a pressure wave that can rupture internal organs without leaving a scratch on the skin. For the German soldier on the ground, the technical specifications matter far less than the terrifying acoustics of the weapon. They begin to call it Stalin's organ because the array of launch rails resembles the pipes of a church organ, and the sound of the launch mimics a demonic musical chord. The noise alone is enough to induce shell shock, a high-pitched screech that bypasses the ears and vibrates in the teeth and bones. It signals that death is coming not as a single bullet, but as a sweeping tide of fire that cannot be dodged or blocked. Even for the Soviet crews operating these machines, the experience is harrowing and physically demanding. Loading the launcher is a grueling task, requiring 2 men to lift the heavy 42-kilogram rockets and slide them carefully onto the guide rails. They must work quickly, often under enemy fire, knowing that their unarmored trucks are essentially mobile bombs sitting on a powder keg. The launch itself blinds them with flash and chokes them with exhaust fumes, forcing them to wear heavy goggles and masks, making them look like alchemists of modern war. The success at Orsha provides a desperate glimmer of hope for the Soviet High Command in Moscow, who are watching their armies disintegrate along the entire front. The Red Army is suffering catastrophic losses, with millions of men encircled and captured. Yet here is a weapon that can check the German advance. The order is immediately given to ramp up production, transforming tractor factories and automotive plants into assembly lines for these rocket launchers. What started as a singular experimental unit under Flerov is about to become the backbone of the Soviet Artillery Corps. However, the secrecy surrounding the weapon remains the highest priority for the NKVD and the military leadership. Flerov and his men operate under a shadow, knowing that they are carrying the state's most guarded technology. Each vehicle in the battery is rigged with a hefty explosive charge, wired to the cabin for immediate detonation. The standing orders are grim and absolute if the battery is in danger of being overrun by the rapid German advance. The crews must blow themselves and their machines to pieces rather than let a single rocket fall into Nazi hands. As the sun sets on that fateful July day, the smoke from the Orsha station can be seen for miles, a black pillar rising against the twilight sky. The Germans halt their advance in that sector, wary of walking into another firestorm, buying the retreating Soviet forces a few precious hours of breathing room. The psychological seed has been planted, and stories of the fiery sword begin to circulate in the mess halls and trenches of the Wehrmacht. The invincible veneer of the German war machine has been scratched, not by a tank or a plane, but by a truck with rails. It is in these early days that the weapon begins to acquire its soul, though it lacks an official name beyond its bureaucratic designation. The letter K stamped on the factory casing stands for the Comintern plant, but the soldiers, seeking comfort in the face of death, will soon anthropomorphize the cold steel. They will name it after a popular song about a girl longing for her beloved, a tender name for a terrifying instrument. But on this day at Orsha, there is no romance, only the raw, industrial efficiency of slaughter that signals a new, brutal chapter in the conflict. Captain Flerov sits in the cab of the lead truck, his face grim and covered in soot, watching the dark road ahead. He knows that Orsha was just the beginning, and that the element of surprise will not last forever. The enemy is adaptable and ruthless, and they will soon learn to listen for the howl of his rockets. But for tonight, the Katyusha, a name not yet spoken but soon to be sung by millions, has announced its arrival on the Eastern Front. The battery disappears into the vast Russian night, ready to unleash its terrifying song again when the enemy least expects it. To understand the terrifying success of the Katyusha, you must first step back into the shadowed corridors of the Jet Propulsion Research Institute in the outskirts of Moscow during the late 1930s. The atmosphere here is not one of triumphant innovation, but of suffocating fear and intense pressure under the watchful eye of the state security apparatus. Engineers work with the knowledge that a single failure could be interpreted as sabotage, a crime punishable by death or exile to the Gulag. It is within this crucible of desperation that the concept of the multiple rocket launcher fights for its very existence against a military establishment obsessed with traditional artillery. The Red Army leadership, particularly the conservative artillery marshals, view rockets with deep suspicion and open disdain, dismissing them as inaccurate toys unfit for modern warfare. They favor the heavy, rifled howitzers that can place a shell on a specific bunker from miles away, regarding the unpredictable scatter of rockets as a waste of precious ammunition. Men like Marshal Grigory Kulik openly mock the early prototypes, arguing that the Soviet Union should invest its limited resources in proven designs rather than gambling on the fantasies of scientists who dream of spaceflight, while the enemy sharpens their bayonets at the border. Despite the resistance from the top brass, a small team of engineers continues to refine the design of the RS-132 aircraft rocket for ground use. They realize that while a single rocket is inaccurate, a salvo of dozens fired simultaneously creates a zone of destruction that no single cannon can replicate. The challenge lies in creating a launcher that is mobile enough to keep up with mechanized units, yet simple enough to be manufactured in non-specialized factories. They strip away everything non-essential, abandoning complex hydraulic aiming systems in favor of simple, hand-cranked gears that a peasant conscript can operate with minutes of training. The breakthrough comes not from a desire for elegance, but from the brutal necessity of the impending war that everyone knows is coming. The engineers settle on a design that looks almost crude to the Western eye, a rack of eye-shaped steel rails welded onto a subframe. This assembly is then bolted onto the chassis of a ZiS-6 utility truck, a six-wheeled workhorse that is plentiful but far from sophisticated. There is no armor protection for the crew and no sophisticated recoil absorption system because the rockets launch with a recoilless blast that pushes back against the air rather than the truck itself. However, the path to the battlefield is paved with the blood of its creators. As the Great Purge sweeps through the ranks of the Soviet intelligentsia, key figures in the rocket program, including the brilliant Georgy Langamak, who laid the theoretical groundwork, are arrested and executed on trumped-up charges of espionage. The survivors are left to continue the work with the ghosts of their colleagues looking over their shoulders, knowing that the only way to save their own lives is to deliver a weapon that Stalin himself cannot ignore. This desperate drive for self-preservation accelerates development far beyond the normal pace of peacetime engineering. When the German Wehrmacht finally crashes across the border in June 1941, the debates about accuracy and efficiency instantly evaporate in the face of an existential crisis. The Soviet Air Force is decimated on the ground in the first days, and thousands of artillery pieces are lost as entire armies are encircled in the west. Suddenly, the cheap, mobile, and easily produced rocket launcher becomes the only viable option to fill the gaping hole in the Soviet lines. The order comes down from the Kremlin to mass-produce the BM-13 immediately. Bypassing the usual years of field trials and safety testing, the production effort centers initially on the Comintern factory in Voronezh, where the workers are thrown into a frantic, round-the-clock schedule that blurs the line between industry and combat. The blueprints are finalized even as the first metal is being cut, and welding torches spark continuously in the dimly lit halls. There is no time for the precise machining found in German factories. Here, rough edges are ignored, and tolerances are loose. The philosophy is stark and practical. A weapon that works 90% of the time today is infinitely better than a perfect weapon that arrives tomorrow. For tomorrow, the Germans might be here. One of the most critical bottlenecks is the production of the solid fuel propellant cords that power the rockets, a dangerous chemical process that requires stability. The standard ballistite powder is prone to cracking in extreme temperatures, which can cause the rocket to detonate in the launcher rail, killing the crew instantly. Chemists work feverishly to stabilize the formula, mixing volatile compounds in makeshift labs while air raid sirens wail outside. They manage to create a propellant that is robust enough to survive the rough handling of the front lines. A silent victory of chemistry that makes the thunder of the Katyusha possible. As the German Army Group Center pushes closer to Moscow, the order is given to evacuate the industrial heartland to the safety of the Urals and Siberia. This is one of the most colossal logistical feats in history, as entire factories are dismantled, loaded onto flatbed trains, and shipped thousands of miles east. The machinery for building the Katyusha is bolted to the floors of unheated boxcars, and production often restarts before the roof of the new factory building is even finished. Workers stand ankle-deep in snow, their hands freezing to the cold steel, assembling the weapons that will save their nation. The workforce that builds these organs of Stalin changes dramatically as the war consumes the male population of the Soviet Union. Experienced machinists and welders are drafted into the infantry, replaced by women, elderly men, and teenagers who have never held a tool in their lives. These new workers are given crash courses in welding and assembly, learning to build the launchers through rote repetition. They work 12, 14, 16 hours a day on meager rations, driven by the propaganda posters on the walls and the knowledge that their fathers and brothers are dying on the front lines for lack of fire support. To maintain the absolute secrecy of the weapon, the launchers are officially designated as Guards Mortar Units, a misleading name intended to confuse German intelligence. The trucks are delivered to the front with canvas covers tied tightly over the rails, and the crews are hand-picked from the most loyal Komsomol members. These young men are forced to sign pledges that they will never allow the enemy to inspect the mechanism, a promise that adds a layer of psychological burden to their already dangerous duty. They are the guardians of the state's magic, operating a machine that is treated with religious reverence. The soldiers who receive these first batch launchers are often baffled by the equipment, which looks nothing like the artillery they were trained to use. There are no optical sights for direct fire, only a simple dial for elevation and a compass for azimuth. The training is rudimentary, focusing on how to position the truck, how to wire the electrical ignition box, and, most importantly, how to run away after firing. They learn that the truck's suspension springs must be locked down with jacks before firing to prevent the vehicle from bouncing violently, a manual process that takes precious minutes under fire. It is during these early, confused deployments that the weapon receives its immortal nickname, cementing its place in the Russian soul. The factory mark K on the side of the launcher stands for the Voronezh Comintern plant, but to the soldiers, K suggests something more human. They begin to call it Katyusha, a diminutive form of Catherine, referencing a popular wartime song about a girl waiting on a steep riverbank for her soldier to return. This personification transforms the cold, industrial machine into a beloved companion, a fierce female protector that watches over the trenches. The contrast between the Soviet Katyusha and the German equivalent, the Nebelwerfer, perfectly encapsulates the diverging philosophies of the two combatants. The German weapon is a toad, six-barreled mortar, highly accurate and beautifully engineered, but slow to move and reload. The Katyusha is inaccurate, burns through ammunition at a staggering rate, and is built with the fit and finish of a farm tractor. Yet, the Katyusha's mobility allows it to concentrate firepower where it is needed and vanish before retaliation, a tactic that the methodical German artillery doctrine struggles to counter. Back in the Urals, the factories have now fully transitioned to a war footing. churning out thousands of rockets and hundreds of launches a month. The initial shortages of explosive chemicals are solved by American Lend-Lease shipments, which provide high-grade powders that actually improve the range and reliability of the rockets. The marriage of Soviet design and American raw materials begins to create a supply chain that will eventually drown the Wehrmacht in explosives. The frantic desperation of 1941 has evolved into a grim, industrial determination that will not stop until the Red Army reaches Berlin. The commanders who once scoffed at the rocket toys now clamor for them, bombarding the Stavka with requests for more Guards mortar battalions. They have seen the effect the weapons have on German infantry attacks, breaking up formations and halting advances with a wall of fire. The Katyusha has proven that in this new kind of total war, quantity has a quality all its own. It is no longer an experiment, it is the hammer of the proletariat, crude and heavy, ready to smash the precision watchwork of the German military machine. As the snow begins to fall in late 1941, the ground hardens, setting the stage for the pivotal Battle of Moscow. The factories have done their impossible work, and fresh batteries of Katyushas are rolling off the flat cars at the railheads behind the capital. The crews, bundled in quilted jackets and felt boots, check the electrical connections on their rails, their breath misting in the freezing air. They are about to introduce the invaders to the full fury of a weapon born from desperation, panic, and the unyielding will to survive. December 1941 descends upon the Soviet capital like a white shroud, bringing with it the most brutal winter in living memory. The temperature plummets to 40 degrees below zero, a cold so absolute that it freezes the oil in engine, sumps and snaps, firing pins like glass. For the soldiers of the German Army Group Center, who stand within sight of the Kremlin's spires through their binoculars, the weather is an enemy more formidable than any rifleman. They are clad in summer uniforms, their greatcoats thin and inadequate against the biting wind that sweeps across the vast, open plains surrounding Moscow. In the German trenches near the town of Klin, the morale that carried the Wehrmacht across Europe is dying a slow, shivering death. Weapons jam as lubricants turn into glue, and bread must be chopped with axes before it can be eaten. The soldiers huddle together in shallow dugouts, burning anything they can find to stay alive. Terrorized by the frostbite that turns toes and fingers black overnight, they know the Red Army is massing for something. But their reconnaissance planes are grounded by blizzards, leaving them blind and deaf to the movement of the steel reserves gathering in the forests ahead. On the other side of the frozen front line, General Georgy Zhukov prepares to unleash the first major Soviet counteroffensive of the war. He has hoarded his reserves carefully, refusing to commit them piecemeal, waiting for the exact moment when the German offensive has exhausted its momentum. Central to his plan are the newly formed Guards mortar regiments, which have been quietly positioning themselves under the cover of the long winter nights. These units are now equipped with improved BM-13 launchers, their crews hardened by months of retreat and driven by a burning desire for vengeance. Lieutenant Viktor Sokolov commands one such battery hidden in a birch forest northwest of Moscow, where the trees are heavy with snow and silence reigns. His men move like ghosts in their white winter camouflage smocks, clearing the firing lanes with padded shovels to avoid making noise. The ZiS-6 trucks have their engines running intermittently to keep them warm, the exhaust plumes rising straight up in the stagnant, icy air. Sokolov checks his map by the light of a shielded lantern, his finger tracing the coordinates of a German supply depot located in a captured village 3 kilometers away. The order to fire comes just before dawn, shattering the stillness of the winter morning with a violence that defies description. The launch of the rockets creates a blinding contrast against the snowy landscape, the bright orange propellant flames illuminating the forest like a sudden sunrise. In the extreme cold, the sound of the launch is amplified, a sharp, cracking roar that travels for miles across the frozen steppe. The rockets leave distinct trails of white smoke that hang heavy in the air, marking the path of destruction as 16 projectiles from each truck scream toward the enemy lines. For the freezing German garrison in the village, the arrival of the Katyusha barrage is an apocalyptic event that offers no chance of survival. The frozen ground, hard as concrete, does not absorb the blast of the high explosive warheads. Instead, It amplifies the fragmentation effect. Shrapnel ricochets horizontally off the ice, turning the entire area into a kill zone, where lying prone offers no protection. The intense heat of the explosions instantly melts the surrounding snow, creating a momentary slush that flash freezes seconds later, trapping the dead and wounded in a gruesome tableau of ice and blood. The psychological impact of fire in such extreme cold cannot be overstated, as it represents a primal elemental clash that terrifies the human mind. German soldiers who survive the initial blast are often too stunned to move, their senses overwhelmed by the sudden transition from silent freezing to roaring inferno. The rockets set fire to the thatched roofs of the village huts and the fuel drums stacked by the roadside, denying the invaders their only source of warmth. Panic sets in rapidly, causing a chaotic rout where men flee into the open fields, only to be cut down by the biting wind or Soviet snipers. Back at the firing position, Sokolov's crew executes the withdrawal with practiced efficiency, fighting against the elements that seek to immobilize them. The heavy trucks struggle for traction on the icy forest tracks, their tires spinning and engines whining in protest as they lurch away from the launch site. The crews must work with bare hands to disconnect the firing cables, skin sticking to the freezing metal. But they do not complain. They know that German counter-battery fire is less accurate in these conditions. But the Luftwaffe, if it flies, will be looking for the dark scorch marks left on the pristine snow. As the Soviet counteroffensive gains momentum on December 5th, the Katyushas act as the sledgehammer that cracks the frozen German line wide open. They are deployed not just to kill, but to create corridors of terror through which the fresh Siberian divisions can charge. These ski troops, well fed and dressed in warm furs, advance under the arching trails of the rockets, cheering as the Stalin's organs play their deadly music. The synergy between the mobile rocket artillery and the winter-hardened infantry creates a rolling wave of pressure that the exhausted Germans cannot withstand. The mobility of the truck-mounted launchers proves to be a decisive advantage over the horse-drawn artillery of the Wehrmacht, which is dying in the snow. While German horses freeze to death or collapse from starvation, the Soviet ZIS trucks, though crude, are rugged enough to keep moving. Soviet mechanics mix gasoline with oil to keep the engines turning and use blowtorches to thaw frozen brake lines. This ability to redeploy rapidly allows the Red Army to concentrate firepower on weak points in the German line, blasting a hole and then moving on before the enemy can reinforce the sector. In the sector near Tula, the Katyushas are used to stop the tanks of General Guderian's Panzer Army, a feat previously thought impossible for unguided rockets. The crews lower the elevation of the launch rails to zero, firing the heavy M13 rockets almost directly at the advancing armor. While a direct hit on a tank is a matter of luck, the sheer volume of high explosives strips the tracks off the panzers and concusses the crews inside. The shockwaves strip the optical sights and radio antennas from the vehicles, rendering the vaunted German panzers blind and deaf in the swirling snow. The retreat from Moscow becomes a nightmare for the Wehrmacht, a trail of tears marked by abandoned equipment and frozen corpses. The roads are clogged with broken vehicles, and every traffic jam becomes a target for the roaming Katyusha batteries. The German soldiers eventually learn to recognize the specific sound of the ZIS-6 engine in the distance, a sound that triggers a Pavlovian response of terror. They have named the weapon the Black Death, a moniker that reflects the charred remains it leaves behind on the white winter canvas. However, the Soviet victory is purchased at a terrible price, and the rocket crews are not immune to the suffering of the front. Living out of their trucks for weeks on end, they sleep in cramped cabins or huddled around exhaust pipes, fighting frostbite and exhaustion. The metal of the rockets becomes so cold that it burns the skin upon contact, requiring the loaders to wear thick felt mittens that make the delicate fusing process clumsy and dangerous. Yet, the knowledge that they are pushing the invaders back from the heart of their motherland fuels a grim determination that overrides physical pain. The logistical effort to keep the batteries fed with ammunition during the blizzard is a heroic struggle of its own. Convoys of sledges drawn by reindeer or hardy ponies bring crates of rockets through the deep drifts where trucks cannot pass. Local women and teenagers form human chains to unload the munitions, passing the heavy crates hand to hand in the darkness. Every rocket fired at the Germans is the result of a monumental collective effort by the Soviet people. a tangible expression of the nation's defiance against the fascist aggressor. By January 1942, the immediate threat to Moscow has been broken, and the German army has been pushed back over 100 kilometers. The fields around the capital are littered with the twisted wreckage of the Blitzkrieg, now buried under fresh layers of snow. The Katyusha has graduated from a secret experiment to the queen of the battlefield, earning the Guard's title in blood and iron. The sight of a battery firing into the winter night has become a symbol of hope for the Soviet people, a fiery promise that the tide of the war is finally turning. As the front line stabilizes, the surviving German commanders write home with a new tone of respect and fear for the Soviet artillery. They describe the helplessness of being under a Katyusha barrage, the inability to predict where the rockets will fall, and the terrifying noise that haunts their dreams. The arrogance of the summer has vanished. Buried in the snowdrifts along with their comrades, they now realize that this is a war of annihilation, and the enemy possesses a weapon that can erase an entire grid square in the blink of an eye. Lieutenant Sokolov stands by his truck, watching the horizon glow with the fires of a burning town, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The Battle of Moscow is won, but the war is far from over, and the road to Berlin is long and bloody. He pats the cold steel of the launcher rail, a gesture of affection for the machine that has saved his life and his city. The organ has finished its concert for the night, but its melody will continue to echo across the Eastern Front for years to come. By the spring of 1942, the war on the Eastern Front has evolved into a grinding stalemate of attrition. But a new element has permanently altered the battlefield's psychological landscape: the sound of the Katyusha. In the trenches of the Wehrmacht, veteran soldiers who have weathered the artillery barrages of France and the aerial bombardments of Britain now find themselves paralyzed by a noise that defies natural explanation. It is not the deep, rhythmic thud of a howitzer, which offers a split second of calculation between the flash and the impact. It is a continuous, escalating shriek that tears through the air, a sound so unnatural that it triggers a primal, involuntary panic in even the most disciplined troops. The German soldiers christen the weapon Stalin orgel, or Stalin's organ, a grimly poetic nickname that captures both the visual and auditory terror it inflicts. The rows of steel launch rails resemble the pipes of a church organ, but the music they play is a demonic symphony of death. When a battery fires, the simultaneous ignition of 16 rockets creates a discordant, grinding roar that sounds like a giant millstone crushing gravel. This noise travels for miles, serving as a terrifying announcement that a grid square is about to be erased. It is a psychological weapon as much as a physical one, designed to break the will before the shrapnel even flies. The acoustics of the rocket are unique due to the crude nature of its propulsion system and the aerodynamics of its flight. As the solid fuel propellant burns furiously inside the casing, it rushes out of the nozzles at supersonic speeds, creating a high-pitched hissing that deepens into a howl as the rocket accelerates. Unlike a spinning artillery shell which cuts through the air with a predictable whistle, the fin-stabilized M13 wobbles slightly in flight, churning the air and creating a fluctuating, wavering screech. This acoustic signature is terrifying because it makes the projectile sound alive, a screaming banshee hunting for its prey on the ground below. For the German infantryman huddled in a foxhole, the psychological torment is exacerbated by the sheer volume of fire that accompanies the sound. A standard artillery battery might fire 4 shells every minute, allowing a soldier to mentally reset and brace between impacts. The Katyusha delivers its entire payload in less than 10 seconds, overwhelming the senses with a saturation of noise and pressure that allows for no respite. The brain cannot process the individual explosions. They merge into a single, rolling thunder that shakes the earth and rattles the teeth, inducing a state of sensory overload known as Kriegsneurose, or war neurosis. German field doctors begin to report a sharp increase in psychiatric casualties in sectors where the Guard's mortar units are active. Men are brought to the rear aid stations with no visible physical wounds, yet they are catatonic, unable to speak, or shaking uncontrollably. They stare effectively through their caretakers, their minds trapped in the loop of that terrible screeching sound. The suddenness of the violence, combined with the inability to predict where the rockets will fall due to their wide dispersion, creates a feeling of total helplessness. There is no safe place to hide, no pattern to learn. Only the caprice of the organ and its random distribution of death. The irony of this psychological terror is not lost on the older officers who remember the early days of the war in the West. During the invasion of France and Poland, the Germans attached Jericho trumpet sirens to their Stuka dive bombers to terrify the populations below. Now, the tables have turned with a vengeance, and the hunters have become the hunted, tormented by a sound far more lethal than a siren. The Soviet command, realizing the power of this fear, begins to employ the Katyushas specifically for harassment fire at night, denying the enemy the ability to sleep and wearing down their nerves through exhaustion. In the deep silence of the Russian night, the sudden activation of a Katyusha battery is a traumatic event that shatters the fragile peace of the front line. A soldier might be dozing in his dugout, finally warm, when the horizon erupts in flashes and the wailing begins. The adrenaline dump is instantaneous and exhausting, forcing the heart to race and the muscles to tense in anticipation of an impact that might be miles away or meters away. Even if the rockets miss, the sleep is ruined, and the cumulative effect of weeks of such interruptions leaves the German army jittery, irritable, and prone to mistakes. Interrogations of captured German prisoners reveal the depth of the superstition and myth growing around the weapon. Many infantrymen believe the Soviets have developed an automatic cannon of immense caliber, or an electrically fired flamethrower system. They speak of the weapon in hushed tones, describing it as the Black Death or the Fiery Hurricane. This misinformation works to the Red Army's advantage, as the fear of the unknown is always more potent than the fear of the known. The Soviet political commissars encourage these rumors, amplifying the legend of the Katyusha as a technological marvel that only the socialist state could produce. The physical sensation of being under a Katyusha barrage is described by survivors as being inside a giant drum that is being beaten by a madman. The overpressure from the simultaneous detonation of dozens of warheads creates shockwaves that collide and reinforce each other. This pressure wave can rupture eardrums and cause internal hemorrhaging in the lungs without a single piece of shrapnel touching the skin. Survivors often wander the battlefield in a daze, bleeding from the nose and ears, their equilibrium destroyed by the concussive force that scrambled their inner ear fluids. The Soviet crews, too, are not immune to the acoustic violence of their own weapon. Despite being behind the launch rails, they stuff cotton and wax into their ears and open their mouths wide before firing to equalize the pressure in their sinuses. The ground around the truck shakes violently during the launch, and the air fills with the acrid, metallic taste of burnt propellant. For them, the sound is the sound of power and retribution, a righteous roar that answers the destruction of their villages. But it still takes a physical toll on their bodies, leaving them deafened for hours after a mission. Tactically, the Red Army commanders learn to use the sound as a tool to flush the enemy out of fortified positions. They will often fire a partial salvo, sending just a few rockets screeching into a village or a forest grove. The terrified German troops, anticipating the full barrage, will break cover and run for the rear, abandoning their heavy equipment and fortified bunkers. Once they are in the open, they become easy targets for conventional artillery, machine gunners, or the remaining rockets in the launcher. Panic, they discover, is a force multiplier that kills more effectively than high explosives alone. The distinct sound of the Katyusha also serves as a massive morale booster for the Soviet infantry waiting in the trenches. When they hear the familiar grinding whoosh from their rear, a cheer often goes up along the line, for they know that Katyusha is singing. It signifies that they are not alone, that the might of Soviet industry is backing them up, and that the enemy is about to suffer. This acoustic bond between the artillery and the infantry creates a sense of unity and momentum, driving the men forward into the attack with the belief that they are supported by an invincible force. Comparing the Katyusha to the German Nebelwerfer highlights the different psychological approaches of the two armies. The German six-barreled mortar makes a distinct, rhythmic moaning sound, earning it the nickname Moaning Mini from Allied troops. It is eerie, but distinct and somewhat precise. The Katyusha, by contrast, is chaotic, raw, and overwhelming, reflecting the brutal, total nature of the war on the Eastern Front. The Nebelwerfer is a precise instrument of a professional army, The Katyusha is the elemental scream of an enraged nation fighting for its survival. As the war drags on, the veterans of the Eastern Front develop a specific 1,000-yard stare that is often associated with the sound of the rockets. In the quiet moments, they find themselves listening intently to the wind, mistaking a gust through the trees for the start of a barrage. The psychological conditioning is so deep that even years later, in the safety of post-war Germany, the sound of a tearing piece of cloth or a sudden screech of brakes can send a former soldier diving for cover. The organ plays a melody that never truly ends for those who heard it in the frozen wastes of Russia. The German propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, attempts to downplay the effectiveness of the weapon, calling it inaccurate and primitive. They film newsreels showing captured launchers and mocking their crude construction, pointing out the rough welds and the wooden benches in the truck cabs. But the soldiers at the front know better. They know that refined engineering means nothing when the air is turning to fire. The disconnect between the official narrative and the grim reality of the front further erodes the trust between the common soldier and the high command in Berlin. By late 1942, the sound of the Katyusha has become the dominant soundtrack of the war, eclipsing the roar of tanks and the rattle of machine guns. It signals the shift in initiative, the growing power of the Red Army, and the inevitable turning of the tide. The Germans have learned to fear the silence, for they know it will inevitably be broken by that terrible, rising wail. The psychological war has been won by the simple, terrifying physics of a steel rail and a solid fuel rocket, creating a legacy of fear that will outlast the war itself. In a dugout near Rzhev, a young German radio operator stops typing as a low rumble begins in the distance, vibration traveling through the earth before the sound arrives. He looks at his sergeant, who simply closes his eyes and grips his rifle, resignation etched into his dirty face. There is no order to give, no maneuver to execute, only the waiting. The howl begins, rising quickly to a crescendo that drowns out all thought, and for the men in that sector, the world dissolves into noise and fire as the organ begins its deadly recital. August 1942 brings a suffocating heat to the southern steppes of Russia, where the Volga River flows lazily toward the Caspian Sea. But in the industrial city of Stalingrad, the air is choked with the grey dust of pulverized concrete and the oily black smoke of burning oil refineries. The German Sixth Army, under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, has reached the banks of the river, slicing the city in two and pressing the Soviet defenders into thin strips of land along the water's edge. It is here, in this rat's war of sewers and basements, that the Katyusha must evolve from a weapon of open-field maneuver into a precise instrument of urban demolition. General Vasily Chuikov, the ruthless commander of the Soviet 62nd Army, understands that he cannot operate the truck-mounted launchers within the city ruins themselves. The streets are too clogged with rubble, and the German Stuka dive bombers rule the daylight sky, hunting for any vehicle that moves. Instead, the Guards mortar regiments are massed on the eastern bank of the Volga, their rails elevated to the maximum angle to lob rockets over the wide river and into the German positions on the western heights. The river itself becomes a distinct front line, a watery no-man's land separating the hunters from their prey. Every night, the sky above the Volga lights up with the streaks of hundreds of rockets arching over the water like fiery comets. For the Soviet infantry clinging to the ruins of the tractor factory and the Pavlov house, these salvos are the only sign that they have not been abandoned. The rockets slam into the Mamiev-Kurgan hill and the rail yards held by the Germans, turning the high ground into a cratered moonscape. The inaccuracy of the weapon becomes less of a liability here, as the German concentration is so dense that almost every rocket finds a target among the packed cellars and trenches. However, the static nature of the fighting forces, the Soviet engineers to improvise new methods for delivering heavier payloads to crush hardened bunkers. The standard M13 rocket, while effective against infantry, lacks the penetrating power to destroy a reinforced concrete basement where a German command post might be hiding. The solution is the M30 rocket, a massive, bulbous projectile carrying a heavy, high-explosive warhead. These are not fired from trucks but from simple wooden crates placed directly on the ground, frames that the soldiers nickname Lucas or Andriusha to distinguish them from the female Katyusha. These heavy rockets are crude, ugly beasts that look like flying propane tanks. But their effect on the urban battlefield is catastrophic for the enemy. Because they are fired from stationary frames, they can be set up inside ruined buildings, firing through holes in the roof or out of blown-out windows. When an M30 battery fires, the wooden crates often shatter from the launch force, making them single-use disposables. The rockets tumble through the air with a terrifying, low-frequency whoosh, visible to the naked eye, before detonating with enough force to collapse an entire 5-story apartment block. Inside the German perimeter, the psychological strain of the constant rocket bombardment begins to erode the discipline of the Sixth Army. The soldiers call the heavy M30 rockets Stuka zu Fuß, or Stuka on foot, because their explosive power rivals that of an aerial bomb. There is no warning siren, only the sudden disintegration of their fortifications. German pioneers try to string wire nets over their trenches to catch the rockets, hoping to trigger the sensitive fuses before they hit the ground. But the sheer blast overpressure still liquefies internal organs and collapses tunnel walls. As autumn turns to winter, the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, prepares the masterstroke that will change the course of history. Operation Uranus. Secretly, under the cover of darkness and heavy snowfalls, massive reserves of artillery and Katyusha launchers are moved to the flanks of the German salient, north and south of the city. The crews work in total radio silence, greasing the elevation gears of their launchers with frost-resistant fat and camouflaging the trucks with white sheets. They are preparing for the largest artillery barrage ever assembled in the history of warfare up to that point. On the morning of November 19, 1942, a thick, freezing fog blankets the steppe, blinding the German forward observers and grounding the Luftwaffe. At exactly 0730 hours, the silence is broken not by a single shot, but by the simultaneous roar of 3,500 guns and mortars, led by the screeching wail of the Katyusha regiments. The sound is so intense that it physically hurts the ears of the Soviet crews. A continuous, rolling thunder that shakes the ground for kilometers. The horizon dissolves into a wall of flashing light as tons of high explosives are hurled into the Romanian lines guarding the German flanks. The effect on the Romanian Third and Fourth Armies is immediate and absolute disintegration. Their positions are not fortified to withstand heavy bombardment, and they lack the anti-tank weapons to stop the Soviet armor that follows the barrage. The Katyushas, used here in massed division-sized volleys, scour entire grid squares of life, burying the defenders in their trenches before they can fire a shot. The psychological shock of the organ is so great that many units simply abandon their weapons and flee into the snowy wasteland, opening the gates for the Soviet encirclement. Within days, the trap snaps shut at the town of Kalach, encircling nearly 300,000 Axis troops inside the Kessel or cauldron of Stalingrad. Now, the role of the Katyusha changes from breakthrough weapon to executioner. The ring of steel tightens every day, compressing the Germans into a smaller and smaller pocket. The Luftwaffe attempts to airlift supplies, but the airfields at Pitomnik and Gumrak are relentlessly pounded by rocket fire, destroying the Junkers transport planes on the ground and leaving the trapped army to starve and freeze. Inside the city ruins, the fighting continues with savage intensity, but the Germans are now running low on ammunition and hope. The Soviet assault groups drag the wooden M30 frames closer and closer to the German lines, sometimes setting them up only 50 meters from the enemy. At this point-blank range, the accuracy is irrelevant. The rockets act as giant demolition charges. A salvo is fired, leveling a stronghold, and the Soviet infantry rushes in through the dust and smoke to clear the survivors with submachine guns and sharpened shovels. The winter of 1,942 inches, Stalingrad is one of the coldest on record, and the Katyusha crews face their own battle against the elements. The grease on the launch rails freezes solid, requiring the men to light small fires under the trucks to thaw the mechanisms. The rockets themselves become brittle, and the propellant burns unevenly in the extreme cold, causing some rounds to fall short. Yet, the crews maintain a frantic operational tempo, knowing that every rocket fired brings the end of the war one step closer. They eat frozen bread and drink vodka to stay warm, their faces blackened by soot and frostbite. As the German perimeter collapses in January 1943, the target area becomes so small that the Soviet commanders must exercise extreme caution to avoid hitting their own converging forces. The Katyushas are used to herd the retreating Germans, firing barrages that cut off escape routes and force them into open squares where they can be surrendered. The once proud Sixth Army is reduced to a ragged mob of starving men wrapped in rags, terrorized by the sound of the Stalin organ that has haunted them since the summer. General Paulus, trapped in the basement of the Wehrmacht department store, can feel the vibrations of the rockets slamming into the streets above him. The constant shelling has destroyed the telephone lines and buried his headquarters in rubble. He realizes that further resistance is futile, a senseless waste of life in the face of such overwhelming firepower. The Katyusha has systematically dismantled his army, destroying its logistics, its fortifications, and finally, its will to fight. The surrender comes on January 31st, bringing a sudden, deafening silence to the banks of the Volga. The aftermath of the battle reveals the true scale of the devastation wrought by the rocket artillery. Entire districts of the city have been ground into brick dust, with the tails of unexploded rockets sticking out of the frozen earth like strange metal weeds. The bodies of German soldiers are found frozen in defensive postures, caught by the blast waves that swept through their positions. The Red Army has learned a crucial lesson in Stalingrad. The Katyusha is not just a weapon of support, but a decisive instrument of annihilation that can break the strongest armies in the world. The victory at Stalingrad resonates around the globe, and the silhouette of the BM-13 truck becomes a symbol of Soviet resilience. The factories in the Urals, emboldened by the success, switch production to even larger and more mobile platforms. The American Studebaker trucks, arriving in large numbers through the Persian corridor, are about to give the Katyusha the mobility it needs to chase the Germans all the way back to the west. The defensive war is over. The steel rain is now ready to move forward. Captain Voronov stands on the western bank of the Volga, looking at the long lines of German prisoners shuffling eastward into captivity. He lights a cigarette, his hands shaking slightly from months of adrenaline and fatigue. Behind him, his battery is already packing up, the crews securing the canvas covers over the launch rails. There is no time to celebrate, for the order has already come down to move west toward Rostov. The organ has finished its recital in Stalingrad, but the concert tour is heading to Germany. By the spring of 1943, the strategic initiative has shifted irrevocably into the hands of the Red Army. But the drive to the west exposes a critical weakness in the Soviet logistical chain. As the front line moves hundreds of kilometers away from the railheads in Moscow and the Urals, the supply lines stretch to the breaking point over the primitive Russian road network. The venerable ZES-6 trucks, which carried the first Katyusha batteries, are beginning to fail under the strain of constant combat and terrible terrain. These modified commercial vehicles, never designed for cross-country warfare, bog down in the spring thaw and lack the power to keep up with the new T-34 tank brigades. The solution to this mobility crisis arrives not from a Soviet factory, but from the other side of the world, carried across the dangerous waters of the Persian corridor. In the dusty ports of Iran, thousands of American heavy trucks are offloaded from Liberty ships, painted in olive drab and stamped with the white star of the U.S. Army. These are the Studebaker US-6 S Rugged 2, 5-ton cargo trucks designed specifically for the rigors of military service. They possess a powerful Hercules engine, a robust 6-wheel drive system, and a durability that the Soviet drivers view as nothing short of miraculous. The marriage of the American truck and the Soviet rocket launcher creates the definitive version of the weapon, designated the BM-13 Newtons, where the N stands for normalized. Soviet engineers in the Gorky assembly plants quickly realize that the Studebaker chassis is far superior to their domestic platforms. It is higher off the ground, allowing it to traverse deep ruts and snowdrifts without bottoming out, and its steel frame is strong enough to withstand the violent recoil of the launch without warping. The launch rails are bolted directly onto the American chassis, creating a hybrid beast that represents the industrial might of the Grand Alliance. The first major test for these new mechanized batteries comes in July 1943, on the rolling wheat fields surrounding the city of Kursk. Here, The Germans assemble the flower of their panzer divisions for Operation Citadel, a final desperate gamble to cut off the Soviet salient and regain the initiative. The Red Army, forewarned by intelligence, prepares a defensive network of unprecedented depth, packed with artillery and dug-in infantry. Waiting in the reserve lines are hundreds of the new Studebaker-mounted Katyushas, ready to rush to any threatened sector and plug the gaps with fire. When the German offensive begins on July 5th, the battlefield erupts into a cauldron of dust, smoke, and burning steel that blots out the summer sun. The German Tiger and Panther tanks, technically superior to anything on the field, push into the Soviet defensive belts, but they are met by a wall of artillery fire. The mobility of the Studebaker trucks allows the Soviet commanders to practice a tactic of fire maneuver, rapidly shifting batteries from one flank to another to meet the main thrust of the German attack. The rockets do not just target the tanks, they strip away the supporting German infantry, leaving the armor blind and isolated. The psychological impact of the Katyusha at Kursk is magnified by the sheer density of the barrage, which surpasses even the horrors of Stalingrad. In the southern sector, where the SS Panzer Corps attempts to force a breakthrough, the Soviet commanders unleash massed volleys that turn entire square kilometers into dead zones. The dry summer grass catches fire from the exploding warheads, creating walls of flame and smoke that confuse the German tank crews and choke the air intakes of their engines. The organ plays a deafening overture that signals the death knell of the German armored force. Following the victory at Kursk, the Red Army transitions into a series of strategic offensives that will not stop until they reach the Elbe. This is where the Studebaker shines, powering through the infamous Rasputitsa, the season of mud that usually paralyzes military operations in Russia, while German horse-drawn supply columns sink to their axles in the thick, blue like clay. The six-wheel drive American trucks power through, slinging mud from their tires but never stopping. The Katyushas can now keep pace with the breakthrough tank units, providing immediate fire support deep in the enemy rear. The Soviet drivers develop a deep affection for their Studas, treating the foreign machines with a reverence usually reserved for religious icons. They marvel at the comfort of the heated cabins, the reliability of the starter motors, and the quality of the toolkits included with every vehicle. Unlike the Soviet trucks, which require constant tinkering and brute force to operate, the Studebaker runs with a smooth efficiency that reduces driver fatigue. This human factor is crucial during the long advances of 1944, where crews often drive for 18 hours a day to catch the retreating enemy. Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944 to liberate Belarus, showcases the full potential of this mechanized warfare. The terrain is a nightmare of swamps, forests, and river crossings that the Germans believe is impassable for heavy vehicles. The Soviets prove them wrong, building corduroy roads out of logs and using the high clearance of the Studebakers to push through the marshes. The Katyusha batteries emerge from the tree lines where they are least expected, raining fire on the German columns, clogging the few available retreat roads. The destruction of Army Group Center is absolute, a catastrophe for the Wehrmacht that exceeds the loss of Stalingrad in both scale and speed. The German soldiers, fleeing in panic toward Minsk, find themselves pursued by a weapon that seems to be everywhere at once. They can no longer outrun the artillery the moment they stop to rest or refuel. The terrifying screech of the rockets fills the air. The shoot-and-scoot tactic is perfected here. A battery roars out of the forest, fires a full salvo in 10 seconds, and vanishes before the smoke has cleared, leaving only destruction in its wake. As the Red Army crosses the pre-war borders and enters Poland and Romania, the supply lines stretch even further, but the logistical backbone holds firm. The Katyusha regiments are now organized into mobile artillery divisions, massive self-contained units that carry their own fuel, ammunition, and repair shops on wheels. These rolling cities of fire can sustain offensive operations for weeks without pausing, a feat of logistics that the German General Staff thought impossible for the primitive Russians. The stream of Studebaker trucks flowing west looks like a river of steel, an unstoppable force of nature. The nature of the targets changes as the war moves into the populated areas of Eastern Europe. The rockets are used to clear heavily defended towns and break the morale of garrisons trapped in the Festung fortress cities declared by Hitler. The inaccuracy of the rockets results in widespread collateral damage, reducing medieval town centers to rubble. But the Soviet commanders are indifferent to the architectural cost. Their priority is the preservation of their infantry's lives. And if 1,000 rockets save one Soviet rifle company, the order is given without hesitation. The German troops facing this onslaught are now a mix of exhausted veterans and raw recruits, including old men and teenage boys from the Hitler Youth. The sound of the Katyusha terrifies them all equally, stripping away the illusion of the master race and replacing it with the primal fear of the hunted. They scramble for cover in ditches and basements, but the sheer volume of high explosives cracks the earth and collapses their shelters. The psychological warfare that began at Orsha Station has now scaled up to a continental level, breaking the will of the Third Reich one salvo at a time. By late 1944, the Red Army stands on the banks of the Vistula River, looking across at Warsaw, and to the south, they are pushing through the Balkans. The Studebaker-mounted Katyushas have travelled thousands of kilometres, their paint scratched and their fenders dented, but their rails still pointing west. They have become the symbol of the Soviet vengeance, a mechanized avatar of retribution that cannot be bargained with or stopped. The crews, now seasoned veterans who have survived the worst of the war, sense that the end is near. The Andreyusha heavy rockets and the standard Katyusha batteries are now joined by even larger caliber systems. But the BM-13 Newtons remains the workhorse of the advance. Its silhouette is instantly recognizable to friend and foe alike: the slanted rails, the canvas cover, and the distinct grille of the American truck. It represents the successful fusion of Allied industrial power and Soviet military ruthlessness, a combination that has ground the Wehrmacht into dust. The road to Berlin is open, and the organs are tuning up for their final, most terrible performance. Sergei, a driver who started the war retreating on foot from Kiev, now sits high in the cab of his Studebaker, watching the sun set over the Polish plains. He pats the steering wheel, grateful for the machine that carried him through the mud of Ukraine and the snow of Belarus. He checks the fuel gauge and the ammunition load, knowing that tomorrow they cross the border into Germany itself. There, on the soil of the aggressor, the Katyusha will sing its loudest song, a requiem for the Nazi regime that will be heard all the way to the bunker in Berlin. April 16, 1945. The banks of the Oder River, east of Berlin. The night is pitch black, a heavy blanket of darkness that conceals the largest concentration of firepower ever assembled in the history of human warfare. Marshal Georgy Zhukov has massed over 2.5 million men and 41,000 artillery pieces along the bridgehead, a coiled spring of steel ready to snap the spine of the Third Reich. Among this forest of guns sit thousands of BM-13 and heavy BM-31 rocket launchers, their rails elevated toward the Silo heights, the last formidable natural barrier standing between the Red Army and the German capital, at exactly 0300 hours. The silence of the European night is shattered not by the sun, but by a man-made dawn of terrified brilliance. Upon Zhukov's signal, 140 high-powered anti-aircraft searchlights flick on simultaneously, blinding the German defenders in their trenches. In that same heartbeat, the artillery opens fire. The sound is beyond deafness. It is a physical pressure that liquefies the ground and vibrates the internal organs of every soldier for miles. The Katyushas join the chorus, their distinct screeching wail rising above the thunder of the howitzers, weaving a tapestry of noise that signals the end of the world for the Nazi regime. The bombardment that follows is so intense that it alters the geography of the Silo heights, churning the soil into a lunar landscape of craters and ash. The rockets, fired in massive division-strength salvos, blanket entire sectors of the German defense lines, burying bunkers and trenches under tons of high explosives. The Stalin organs are no longer the desperate weapons of 1941, fired by retreating crews in the forests. They are now the instruments of ultimate judgment, delivering a verdict of fire that allows for no appeal. The German soldiers, many of them old men and teenage boys, are driven insane by the noise and the concussion, unable to fight back against the sky itself. For the crews of the Katyushas, this moment is the culmination of 4 years of blood, sweat, and sorrow. They work with the rhythmic precision of factory machines, loading the heavy rockets, connecting the ignition cables, and firing. Over and over again, the barrels of the launchers glow red-hot, and the paint on the rails blisters and peels. But there is no stopping. They are fueled by a burning desire for retribution, driving them to push their equipment beyond its limits. Every rocket that screams westward carries the ghostly memory of a burning Russian village, a starved child in Leningrad, or a hanged partisan in Belarus. The breakthrough at Silo is bloody and difficult, but the sheer weight of the Soviet metal eventually crushes the resistance. The tank armies race through the gap, and the Katyusha batteries struggle to keep up with the frantic pace of the advance. The drivers of the Studebakers push their trucks through the chaotic traffic of the advancing army, dodging T-34 seconds and supply wagons. Desperate to reach the outskirts of Berlin, they know that the prize is just ahead, the lair of the beast that unleashed this war, and they intend to be there when it falls. On April 20th, Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday, the first artillery shells begin to fall on the center of Berlin. The Katyushas set up position in the suburbs, their rails pointing directly at the heart of the city. The irony is lost on no one. The capital that once dreamed of ruling the world for 1,000 years is now being systematically dismantled by the very subhumans it sought to exterminate. The rockets rain down on the Alexanderplatz and the government district, turning the neoclassical architecture into heaps of burning rubble. The psychological terror of the organ now comes to the very people who cheered the war's beginning. As the Red Army pushes into the city streets, the nature of the rocket warfare changes once again. The tall buildings and narrow canyons of Berlin make high-angle indirect fire difficult, so the crews improvise with deadly ingenuity. They use the heavy BM-31 Andriusha rockets, which are fired from simple wooden crates or frame launchers, to demolish fortified buildings at point-blank range. If a sniper or machine gun nest holds up the advance, a heavy rocket is dragged forward, aimed through a window or down a street, and fired. The resulting explosion collapses the entire structure, ending the resistance in a cloud of dust. The fighting in Berlin is a savage, room-to-room struggle, a descent into a concrete hell where no quarter is asked or given. The Katyusha trucks are vulnerable in these tight confines, susceptible to Panzerfausts fired from cellar windows. To counter this, the Soviet commanders use them in direct fire mode, sometimes digging trenches for the front wheels of the trucks to lower the launch angle to zero. They fire the rockets horizontally down the wide avenues like the Frankfurter Allee, sweeping the streets clear of barricades, vehicles, and infantry with a hurricane of shrapnel and blast waves. The noise of the battle for Berlin is a constant, maddening roar that denies the city's inhabitants any sleep or sanity. In the flak towers and the deep bunkers, the German civilians huddle in darkness, listening to the distinct, grinding shriek of the Soviet rockets. It is the sound of approaching doom, a reminder that the front line is getting closer by the hour. The propaganda of the wonder weapons that would save Germany has evaporated. The only reality now is the Stalin organ and its relentless, crushing advance. The psychological conditioning of the weapon is complete. Its sound alone induces a state of hopeless resignation. By late April, the ring of steel has tightened around the government district, the citadel, where the Reichstag and the Chancellery stand. The Soviet artillery density reaches an unimaginable level, with a gun or launcher for every few meters of front line. The Katyushas are lined up in the Tiergarten Park, stripping the leaves from the trees with their backblasts. The crews chalk messages onto the warheads of the rockets for Stalingrad, for Sevastopol, for the tears of our mothers. These are not just munitions, they are physical manifestations of the collective Soviet rage, delivered via solid fuel propulsion. The assault on the Reichstag begins on April 30th, under a sky choked with smoke and ash. The Katyushas join the final overture, pounding the massive stone building and the surrounding Königsplats. The rockets smash into the thick masonry, blowing apart the desperate defenses of the SS troops holding out inside. The air is thick with the smell of cordite, burning paper, and decaying bodies. Amidst this inferno, the Red Army infantry surges forward, the red banner clutched in their hands, supported by the unceasing rhythm of the rocket artillery that clears their path. When the news of Hitler's suicide spreads, The resistance begins to fracture, but the fanatical diehards fight on. The rockets continue to fly until the very last moment, ensuring that the surrender is total. On the morning of May 2nd, the garrison commander, General Weidling, finally orders the surrender of the city. Slowly, gun by gun, the firing stops. For the first time in years, a strange and heavy silence descends upon the ruins of Berlin. It is a silence so profound that it rings in the ears of the soldiers, louder than the explosions that preceded it. The crews of the Katyushas climb out of their trucks, their faces black with soot, their eyes rimmed with red from exhaustion. They look around at the devastation they have wrought, the skeletal remains of buildings, the burning tanks, the crushed dreams of a hateful empire. There is no cheering at first, only a collective exhale, a release of the tension that has been held since 1941. They touch the cooling rails of their launchers, the metal still warm, realizing that the job is finally done. The machine that was born in secrecy and desperation has carried them to the very center of the enemy's power. In the days that follow, the streets of Berlin become a gathering place for the victorious armies. Amidst the rubble, an accordion player from a rifle regiment sits on the bumper of a Studebaker US-6, a BM-13 launcher. He begins to play a familiar melody, and one by one, the soldiers join in. They sing Katyusha, the song about the girl on the steep riverbank, the song that gave the weapon its name. The music drifts over the ruins of the Nazi capital, a haunting and beautiful counterpoint to the years of screeching rockets. The girl has found her soldier, and the war is over. The legacy of the Katyusha is etched into the history of the Eastern Front, a symbol of the Soviet Union's industrial triumph and military ruthlessness. It was not a precision instrument, it was a blunt force object, a hammer that smashed everything in its path. From the panic at Orsha Station to the snows of Moscow, from the ruins of Stalingrad to the streets of Berlin, the Stalin organ defined the sound of the war. It changed the way artillery was used, prioritizing volume and mobility over accuracy, and proving that quantity has a quality all its own. As the documentary fades to black, the image lingers on a single BM-13 launcher, silhouetted against the setting sun in a quiet field. The rails are empty, pointing harmlessly at the sky. The terror it inspired has faded into history, but the echo of its howl remains in the memories of those who survived. It stands as a silent monument to the millions who died in its wake and the millions it helped to save. The symphony of destruction has played its final note, and the world is left to rebuild in the quiet that follows the storm. The screen goes dark, leaving only the sound of the wind blowing through the launch rails, a ghostly whistle that sounds almost like a sigh.